Hi, I'm Ashley Thompson, and we are in week 1 of Emotional Intelligence in the Workplace. This week we will be talking about 2 of Bar-On's 15 EQ competencies, self-regard and self-awareness. Throughout the presentation we will learn what these 2 terms are, what the professionals are saying about these terms and the importance they are to leadership, and possible implications. We'll start with self-regard. Simply stated, self-regard is a sense of one's own dignity or worth. The Merriam-Webster dictionary defines self-regard as the consideration of oneself or one's own interests. Bar-On writes that self-regard is the ability to accurately perceive, understand, and accept oneself. The picture on this slide is of a little boy with a cape wrapped around him. Clearly, his self-regard is pretty high. The first article I wanted to discuss related to self-regard is an article titled Positive Self-Regard and Claim to Leadership, 2 Fundamental Forms of Self-Evaluation. This article defines positive self-regard, or PSR, as people's contentedness with themselves in comparison with their own standards. Factors that measure PSR are depression, self-esteem, and neuroticism, which is anxiety, self-doubt, depression, or shyness. This article's research resulted. The second article that I came across regarding self-regard is called Individual Characteristics and the Disposition Effect, Opposing Effects on Confidence and Self-Regard. This article was interesting because it was a research study analyzing opposing effects on confidence and self-regard, but it was related to the world of finance and investments. The research results indicated that the investors with lower self-regard would hang on to these losing investments longer than those with higher self-regard. And then there were similar results with confidence levels in investors. Those with high confidence would hang on to low-performing investments longer than individuals with lower confidence levels. And we know from Cohen et al. That individuals with higher levels of self-regard are less affected by threats to self-image. Although this article was related to the investment world, it can be applied to industries across all work types. Let's turn to some specific examples of self-regard. I have 2 specifically for myself, one being from college. I played volleyball throughout college, and I noticed that the more confident and higher self-regard I had for myself, the better I played. I think that's probably pretty typical for most athletes. Moving towards a specific example in the workforce, I've found that I have higher respect for bosses that have a high self-regard. I find these individuals to be confident, well-spoken, assertive, and reassuring. I also find that these type of individuals that exude high self-regard tend to have higher success with our clients. They're well-liked throughout the firm, and they're just really good role models for younger staff. As discussed on the last slide, managers with higher self-regard typically have a high impact on their employees. Their confidence makes it easy for employees to fall in line and believe in the company's mission. Leaders with high self-regard are able to identify their own weaknesses and areas for improvement while not doubting their ability to develop their leadership skills. A leader with high self-regard is often referred to as a servant leader, someone who puts the organization first and the most committed to his or her team. I found this quote by Eleanor Roosevelt to be very fitting. She says, "No one can make you feel inferior without your consent." It got me thinking, how can we improve one's self-regard? Well, here are 6 bullet points. Stop listening to the negative inner narrative that says you're not good enough. Identify what the worst case scenario is. If you move forward and take a risk to do something outside your comfort zone. Speak confidently. Be open to feedback. Don't become defensive. If someone offers you constructive feedback, they usually have a good intention. Practice your power pose before presenting to a group, and be compassionate to yourself. Practice appreciation for the good things you have in your life, even if they are small. Turning now to self-awareness. Simply stated, self-awareness is being aware of one's own self. The Merriam-Webster dictionary defines it as an awareness of one's own personality or individuality. Bar-On writes that self-awareness is one's intrapersonal ability to be aware and understand one's emotions. I found 2 really interesting articles regarding self-awareness. The first was an article written by Edward O'Neill titled Leading, Not Managing Through a New World Order. The article provided frameworks to help leaders effectively make major changes in their organizations. To do this, O'Neill argues that they must have strong self-awareness. The second article that I found is called Self-Awareness, Perspective Taking, and Egocentrism. This was written by students at the University of Palermo in Italy. Specifically, the article examined participants' self-awareness by conducting several experiments with students across the campus. The results indicated that self-aware students connect easier with their peers, they're less likely to have false consensus beliefs when understanding fellow students' perspectives. The article also argues that focusing attention to the self can foster perspective taking and thus reduce egocentrism. As an auditor in public accounting, I know that my data analytics skills could be stronger. I recently found myself on a project where I needed to be able to manipulate a large amount of data and interpret it in a meaningful way. I knew that I couldn't do this with my current skill set, so instead I sought guidance from a few coworkers who specialize in big data projects. I also educated myself in order to be able to navigate the data to find meaningful results. I also learned something new along the way. I think that this required a lot of self-awareness to recognize that I needed help, I needed assistance, and I needed to educate myself on something new. Both research articles had similar conclusions in that leaders must be self-aware. They must be able to understand and acknowledge their own skill profile. What are they good at? What are they not good at? Where can they improve? They must know their strengths and weaknesses. And finally, these leaders must be aware of their own thoughts and reservations regarding certain activities in the workplace. Another fitting quote from Socrates, "To know thyself is the beginning of wisdom." How can you improve your self-awareness? Look at data objectively, ask for honest feedback, and don't be afraid of what you hear, and find ways to develop yourself. Remember that improving one's self-awareness is a continual process. It doesn't happen overnight. What did we learn? Self-regard and self-awareness are must-need traits for effective leaders. Both attributes don't need to be inherent or natural, they can be learned. Strong managers not only exude competence and have high self-regard, but they know themselves well enough to identify areas for improvement. Through this week's research, I found that of Baron's 15 EQ competencies, self-awareness and self-regard are two very commonly identified traits of leaders. Both self-awareness and self-regard come up frequently when you Google or research anything related to what makes strong leadership.